I guess it's time then, Stephanie, if you can get started.
Great. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. My name is Stephanie McCorkle. I am the Safe Passage for Children of Minnesota Operations Manager and Volunteer Coordinator. You're joining us today at one of our free webinars. We are excited to have you and excited to have our presenter. Our presenter today is Andrew Campbell. He is a noted expert in domestic violence, family violence. He will talk more about that. I just have a few housekeeping notes to share with you, so here they go. Currently, you are signed in with us through Zoom, and during the presentation, we will have everyone's microphones muted. If you don't see your microphone muted, if you please mute it for us, that would be great. Thank you so much. During the presentation, if you have a question or a comment, you can use the Zoom chat feature. And usually you can find that at the bottom of your screen. If you click on the little module that says more, or there could be 3 dots there, you'll see the option for a chat to come up. And in the chat module, you can type a question to our speaker, Andrew Campbell, or you can check to be able to chat to everyone, or you can chat with individual participants. So if you can look at the chat module, you can see there's a number of options there. We would love to see everyone cameras on so we can see who has joined us and be together. We understand if you can't have your camera on for some reason, if you have a lot going on in the background, or you just prefer to have your camera off, that's fine too. The format for our presentation is that first we'll have our speaker, Andrew Campbell, and he will present. And following that, we'll have some time for your comments and questions to Andrew. And we invite you to stay for the whole time if you can. But if you need to leave after the presentation, but before the Q&A time starts, we understand as well. We expect the presentation itself to last about 30 minutes, give or take, and then we'll have time for Q&A afterwards. A recording of this presentation will be available after we are finished. It will take some time for me to process it, so expect it on our website later tonight or check back tomorrow morning. You can go to our website at www.safepassagemn.org, and you can hover over the navigation header entitled Events, and a drop-down menu will appear, and it will show the October 14th webinar with Andrew Campbell. Just click on that link, and a page will open up, and on that page there will be a video recording of the webinar as well as links to other documents or related information that is shared in the presentation today. And thanks again. My name is Stephanie McCorkle. I'm here with Safe Passage for Children in Minnesota. We're very happy to have you. I'm going to turn it over now to our Executive Director, Rich Gurman.
Thank you, Stephanie. I do want to mention one thing, which is that now I'm getting some feedback. You can hear me, but I just have one source of sound, so I shouldn't hear that. But anyway, I want to mention one thing, which is actually this.
I'm getting a lot of feedback too, Rich, just so you know.
Yeah,
I'm not sure if there's something going on in the...
I'm not sure what that is. Hold on. I think, let me just try something. Okay, is that, can you hear me still?
I can hear you. Yep.
You can hear me still? Yeah.
Yes.
No?
Yes, and there's no feedback, so that's good.
Yep.
Yep,
right, but I
good.
couldn't tell if you can still hear me now, can you?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
This is the middle of a 3-part webinar series on COVID-19 and its impact on children who are out there, suffering from some form of maltreatment. And so the format for this 3-part series is a little longer. Rather than a 30-minute presentation, it's more like 50 or 60 minutes of presentation, but we've extended the time of the webinar so that we have an hour and a half, and there'll be plenty of time for Q&A and conversation afterwards. So it is a little longer format. And I do want, before we start, to just share other webinars coming up. 2 weeks from now, we have Dr. Marty Erickson. Those of you who went to the fundraiser saw part of the video. We had some technical problems, but you saw part of the video with her, and we're going to show the entire video. It's about 25 minutes on her findings about the long-term effects of child maltreatment, and also a program that she pioneered called STEEP, which is which works on breaking the intergenerational cycle of abuse. It's a very informative video, and Dr. Erickson may or may not be with us, but the video stands alone, and we'll have plenty of time to talk about it. Then on November 11th, we'll have the third part of this COVID series, all of whom are featuring people who have a national kind of footprint with their work. Victor Veith, many of you know, many of you don't, but he is the Director of Education Research for the Zero Abuse Project here in the Twin Cities at the Mitchell Hammond Law School. And his group trains about 30,000 people nationally a year who are child protection workers mostly, but other first responders as well, in the basics of child protection, including particularly interviewing techniques. And he and his team put together 25 tips for multidisciplinary teams on dealing with COVID-19. You can read the rest of the bio that we have there on our website under our events. But he is, kind of a local treasure, and we'll be sharing a lot of his work. And then the last webinar of the year on December 2nd, Judy Shordahl and her staff from St. David's Center for Child and Family Development, the services they provide. This is a really highly regarded agency in the region, and they do a lot of the work that we have promoted legislatively in terms of funding and in terms of funding the legislature. So they are the kind of people that do the work that we are trying to get people to fund and do. So those are the remaining webinars, and I'll just leave that up for a minute, but it's also on our website. And then let me just then go straight ahead and introduce Andrew. Andrew is an expert on family violence and the associated risks of harm for adults, children, and animals residing in homes where violence occurs. So he uses cutting-edge data analysis, which endears him to many of us in and of itself. And also he has a cross-discipline approach to collaborations and to analysis of what's going on with family violence. And he also shares a personal perspective on violence in the home. So Andrew provides education for agencies around the world and assists in developing a more efficient and effective response to physical and emotional violence. So with that, if you all will bear with me for a minute, I'm going to make him the presenter and let him run with this, and I will talk with you after his presentation. You should have it now, Andrew, I think.
Let's see. Looks like it's working.
Yes, I don't know, Andrew, if you're talking, but we're not hearing you.
Look like, are you hearing me now?
Yes, sir.
Yep, okay.
We do see your screen.
Now you should have my presentation. Everything look good for those who can see?
I think I have an idea of what I need to do on this.
You're still working on something, Rich? I'm sorry, I'm just making sure Can people see my presentation and hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Are we all good, Rich?
Okay, bear with me. I think I know how to do a fix for this. Okay, now, are you able to, could you say something then?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. And if everyone else, if you don't mind muting your mic, I think sometimes that's how we get the feedback just from other, I mean, this is a whole different era that we live in now. Last year I spoke, I think 42 times, and it was 24 different states, all of them in person. And this year everything's online, so learning how to adjust to all of these things. But I think sometimes we get that feedback when mics aren't muted. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. These are topics I feel very passionately about, which should come through in the presentation. This is more than work for me. It's personal. I lived through a lot of things that I'll describe today. And so I often want to, I know everyone here who, you're here for a reason, and many of you work in the field and deal with these types of issues. I still like to give a trigger warning though, because there seems to be something particularly impactful when we bring in the pet piece. And it's not to say that people don't, that people care more about pets than humans. That's not at all it. But but there is something. And when I would speak last year in person and do more of these types of things, you could just tell. And so I do want to give that. It's easier when we're doing this type of format for you to step up, or step away, walk away, whatever you need to do. But please take care of yourself. One of the things I always say is, we can't best help others if we're not taking care of ourselves. So I just like to give that. There is something extra about adding the pet piece. Many of the things we're going to talk about today, and I'll share a clip of the article, or at least an image of it as we go on, but are from a recently published article that I had published by Elsevier that's available in the chat box. So even you could do it now or as I'm speaking, but if you go into the chat box, I've shared it there and you should be able to access it and download it for free. Often asked why family violence, why do I focus on these types of issues? As I said, it's more than work for me, it's personal. So there you see me with my dog Shelby. That dog saved my life. There's no other way to put it. I grew up in a home where partner abuse occurred between my parents. It was nothing physical, just quote unquote, just emotional, right? And yet here I am 20 years later, still dealing with those emotional impacts and those emotional effects. We obviously physical injury is important and we prioritize it and know those types of things. But the reality is, bruises may fade and fractures will heal. Those emotional injuries last a lifetime. And I still deal with that. I understand the benefits of thinking of those who come from these types of environments as survivors. But I think it's more accurate almost to put it, especially when we're talking about emotional harm, as surviving, because it does not relent. So a lot of my passion comes from my own experiences there. And again, the dog that saved my life. I can remember at 13 waking up to my mom upset, crying, and picking her up off the floor and saying, if you won't let him back, I will take care of you and my 6-year-old sister. I'll do whatever it takes. I got a job before I was legally able to, and save the next 13 years taking care of them. So that's where a lot of this passion comes from those lived experiences throughout my youth and early adulthood. The reality, when we talk about family violence and particularly emotional harm, is not only does it steal childhoods, as it did steal mine. I was good at sports. I loved sports. I had to quit all of that to get jobs and to think of other things and to take care of my family. But the reality is not only does it steal from our childhoods, but it steals from our adult life as well. Research is very clear about the significant impact of emotional harm throughout youth. I myself have observable MRI brain changes that I think will limit my ability to public speak. I'm already noticing some issues as I get further and further into this. Not to be overly dramatic, but I had 2 presentations in the last couple of years, one at the University of Michigan and another in New Mexico, where I had to stop and had a pretty significant health scare. Essentially, everything I talk about comes at a cost because it causes me to relive the trauma and emotional harm I experienced. But again, it just feels so unfair. Not only does it steal my childhood, but it's going to shorten my adult life too, likely, and time, precious time, that I would like to spend with my own children. So again, that's where you'll hear the passion as I speak today, and this is a big part of how I fight back. So I appreciate the opportunity very much. So I know we still have a few months left of 2020, but I've already felt comfortable enough to go ahead and give my review of it. It's been a really rough year. I think essentially the default is to give 1 star, so I gave it that. I don't know if it's even earned that. It's been a tough year. It's been tough for many reasons, and it's been hard on everyone. Right. We know that some have been disproportionately negatively impacted, as we'll get into as we talk today. But it's been a difficult year. As I talk often, as I said, around the country and some international presentations as well. Even before all this started, before COVID-19 and our response to it kind of complicated our response to family violence. When you look at data and research and what's published in terms of how domestic violence is occurring or its prevalence around the country, depending on your report source, I mean, and my take is we really have no clue. Some people say that it's going down, others say it's staying the same, others say it's going up. As I'm sure many of you know, there are so many reasons why victims do not report this violence in the home, and so it's very hard to take an accurate sample and pulse of what's occurring. Again, even before everything that we're dealing with now complicated things. A different way to look at it, though, that I think is helpful, is we do know that domestic violence affects as much as 30 to 40% of families involved in the child welfare system. Depending on where you are in the country, it will take up as much as 50% of all law enforcement calls. Several, I think most of these agencies are on the East Coast, but there are several that literally half of their calls for law enforcement all year are related to domestic disturbance or domestic violence. We know it makes up as much as 35% of all hospital ER visits. One thing I always like to note, because I think it's important to think about, is we see adult victims in these homes often being more likely to be able to seek care for their children than themselves. So if you're in a medical center and you're working with children, children's hospital, you may have a great opportunity to detect a child who's residing in a dangerous or abusive environment, as well as their parent as well. So again, just something important to note, that we see this high number in ER and ED visits, but remember that children may be more likely able to seek care than adults. So we know it's prevalent. Again, regardless of what we're hearing from other numbers. And again, as I often spoke in person last year, I would ask the question, do you feel domestic violence is declining in your community? I never had a single hand in all the states and all the times I spoke. It was always the opposite, that agencies were feeling inundated and buried in these types of calls, again, before our response to COVID-19 likely further complicated that. As I said, and it doesn't mean that there aren't good agencies out there doing good things, but in my opinion, the scoreboard didn't look good even before all of this. I have no reason to believe we were winning the fight against family violence. Again, I think it's something that impacts so many. The estimates of 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men in the U.S. experiencing partner violence, and that's just physical or sexual abuse, doesn't even include emotional abuse, I think are probably about the closest to accurate as we're going to get. And I think that's obviously extremely concerning when we think about those types of numbers. Here's a study that I'll be pulling a lot of the information from today that I share. And again, that you can access and download now in the chat box. When we think about how our response to the virus, and again, this is a necessary response. I understand the need to take these types of actions. But many of these actions that we did take to reduce the spread of the virus, I think pretty obviously increased risk of family violence. It was around March when I became extremely worried. Looking at some of the data and information out of China and what was occurring in their lockdown scenarios, that I became sick. I had trouble sleeping. I just knew if we did the same and if we continue to do the same, family violence was likely to skyrocket. I'm here located in Indianapolis, Indiana. I reached out to local government leaders and officials without much success, and so in kind of desperation, then I went to the computer and started writing, and at least trying to get this information out there, which is the article, as I said, that you can access. But when we think about some of these specific actions, and we think of closing schools, libraries, and churches, all of these things are critical for families impacted. Well, many of them for all families, but especially for families impacted by abuse. The library may not be a piece that we often recognize, but it's an important one for them as well. I think of many adults and children describing the library being a reprieve from abuse, a place where they could go to get away from everything that was occurring in the home. I think of adults saying, if limited, or if their internet access or social media access was limited, they could go to the library to access those types of things. These places were extremely important to these families, and then essentially, in a moment, they were all taken away. Closing bars and restaurants may not seem as obvious when we talk about family violence, but the reality is, in my work and in my studies, and any of my other studies that I mentioned today that you have interest in, please email me, and I would be glad to share those as well. But 74% of the highest risk perps, and again, we're always concerned about family violence and everyone's at risk in these homes, but highest risk implies that they abuse animals as well. The data is just overwhelming, and we'll get into that as we go on today, for risk in these homes. But it's such a high proportion of them abuse alcohol and have mental illness. And if bars and restaurants are closed, where are they drinking? They're still drinking, and now they're drinking in the home. So again, we think about this increased risk there. When we encourage social distancing and the idea of self-quarantine, again, these are common tactics that perpetrators almost always use. And now it's likely been furthered by these actions, as victims are even more likely to find themselves trapped in a home with an abuser. Another important point about the self-quarantine piece is victims, at least in my studies and my work with law enforcement data, seem much more likely to make that 911 call to report abuse when the abuser leaves. They tend to wait to when they're no longer on scene. And when do they have an opportunity to do that? During lockdown, right? They're trapped in the home with the abuser, and there was limited chance to do that. And then we also know things such as limited resources and layoffs, again, we're increasing stress and we're furthering risk in these homes. This wasn't something just, again, specific to the US. We saw it all over the world. I only included a handful of countries there, but most countries reported pretty significant increases. I think, just kind of an estimate off the top of my head, I would look at something around 30 to 50% increase in perpetrated domestic violence and abuse such as that. Unfortunately, what we observed in many of these countries and communities in our own country is this idea where rates seem to drastically increase right before lockdown occurred. Lockdown happened, and the calls just dropped off. And in some communities they continued, but in many they just dropped off and the phones went silent. And it would be nice if we had a reason to celebrate that and assume that abuse is down, but obviously we fear the opposite is true, that abuse is probably increasing and victims just have no opportunity or means of being able to make that call. But again, the point of the slide being that we saw these types of things occurring and increasing all around the globe. When I think about risk factors for abuse perpetration in homes, again, I do it carefully because we know domestic violence, child abuse, they can occur in any home. I think of my own personal experiences and my background, and the perpetrator in my situation was extremely good at hiding it. Did not present in a way that you would assume that they were causing this type of harm. So I always am careful when I say risk factors. These are things that research indicates come up most frequently when we talk about these types of things, but it doesn't mean that abuse only occurs in these homes. But the risk factors there in the center that you most often see in studies are low income, limited education, unemployment. We also know that obviously being victimized yourself in youth puts you at greater risk of committing harm, and that drugs and alcohol often at the very least drives severity, that they result in an increased risk of more severe types of incidents. Look at these outer circles though, and you see all the extra risk factors that increased during COVID-19 and our response to it. We saw children being much more likely to be in the home, at times even being watched by adults they wouldn't normally, or that wouldn't normally be providing care for them. We saw that happen often. But again, everyone's in lockdown. They can't go anywhere. They can't go to work, can't go to school. They're just in the home together. Resources are even further limited. We see limited accountability, as we'll get into as we continue. Just again, when we think about accountability, we think of kids going to school or others outside the home, being able to visualize individuals in these homes and knowing that's not going to happen. Empowered a lot of perpetrators in many ways. Closing the bars, again, forced drinking in the home, gun sales through the roof. And again, this idea of increasing fear, uncertainty, and helplessness. We're adding stress and we're dramatically increasing risk for harm in these homes. And who pays the price, right, when we think about these things? And again, I have the perpetrator picture here as a male and the adult victim as a female. We know that men are also victimized by domestic violence and intimate partner violence. I'm focusing a lot on the pet piece today too. And when we add in that piece, it's almost always a male perpetrator and female victim. Our numbers get closer to 94 to 96%, at least of what's reported. So again, doesn't mean it can't happen in any home, but that's why you'll see it pictured that way, because when we talk about the pet abuse angle, as I'm bringing in today, it's almost always a male perpetrator, again, of what's reported. But when we think about who pays the price in these homes, when we think of these things, again, we're thinking about the adult victim, children, and pets in these homes as well. One of the things that I think is important to point out today as we're talking about this topic, and this is from another study, I think this was maybe 2016. I analyzed nearly 10,000 police reports of domestic violence in Indianapolis, looking at various characteristics and information and things like that. A lot of the prior data and information that's out there on domestic violence is taken from retrospective anonymous victim surveys, which are good and can provide helpful information. But when you add, or when you look at police reports for studies, as I often do, you have something different. You have a date and a timestamp of when the call came in. So while, again, these retrospective anonymous surveys provide valuable information, they often can't tie it to a specific day, but rather something that occurred in the past. So my study was one of the first to look at it this way. And what I noted is when we look at, again, in Indianapolis, police reports for domestic violence most commonly came in on Sundays. And again, this is when I'm, again, in person, when I'm talking, people usually immediately ask, well, is it Saturday night spilling into Sunday morning? And no, that's not the case. This is Sunday afternoon, Sunday evening, where we're seeing this high number of reports, not just specific to Indianapolis. I've repeated it in multiple states and found the same thing to be true. I share this today and why I think it's important to this topic because of the reasons that I hear when I dig deeper into this and this idea of abuse, or at least what's reported being more likely to occur on Sundays. Abusers describe things such as, the children had been in the home all weekend. They didn't want to go to school on Monday. They were just really wound up and full of energy. We hear abusers also say things such as, my stress was high. I didn't want to go back to work on Monday, and this is what occurred. And then we often hear families too describe this is the only day of the week where we're all in the home together. Neither adult is working on Sunday. Kids aren't in school. Everyone's together. And so again, when you think about everything I've described in terms of COVID-19 and our response to it, we essentially created months full of Sundays, right? Essentially all the characteristics that seem to make Sunday the day where we see the highest number of reports are what every day looked like throughout the months of lockdown. And again, I think it's so important to remember that. Like I said, I get our response and I understand our need to take action to slow the spread of the virus. But at least in my community and in many others I've worked with and talked to, it just felt like these vulnerable families and what was best for them was just never even at the table. I can remember in my own city, again, in Marion County and in Indianapolis area, it wasn't until we had several homicides that someone came forward and said, hey, just so you know, if you're not safe from abuse in your home, you shouldn't remain locked down. And again, that's something that I don't think we should ever assume, and something that I think would have been helpful to make as a clear message. Because for these families, for many of them, there was absolutely nothing safe about being trapped in these types of environments. With perpetrators being empowered by the idea that no one would know for many weeks or months what even occurred. I know Marie shared this in her presentation. I watched that in the series prior to me, but another important point to make that I do want to share as well is when we look at where reports of child abuse and neglect come from in the U.S., we see the most reports coming from the school system. Many schools obviously don't operate year-round, so I think that's even more compelling when we think about the fact that they don't have all year to report incidents. We still see them reporting the majority of these incidents. Obviously, when schools shut down, that just completely dropped off. Legal and law enforcement, we saw many courts and legal systems dramatically changed their procedure, and we lost a lot of opportunity there. Social services, some of them were even shut down, depending on what community you were in, or severely limited. Medical personnel, we saw, and what I hear from victims all the time is that they feared that they would get the virus if they reported for medical assistance. And some of my prior studies have found that only about 19% of injured domestic violence victims ever even do report for medical assistance. But that number was obviously likely to be significantly limited during this period too. Friends, family, we were encouraged kind of all to stay away from each other. So who was left to report child abuse? And that's something that I think is so important to remember and think about. And if this type of scenario ever happens again, hopefully it doesn't, but if it does, just remembering, here's who reports abuse. If we take all of these people out of the picture, who's going to continue to report abuse, because it's probably going to still continue to happen. I know Marie talked about too we have seen in multiple communities, and this I think is in Texas, I'm pretty sure, yeah, Cook Children's, this idea that while child abuse numbers and the calls reporting abuse dropped, we did see an increase in fatal injuries related to child abuse, as well as ER visits related to child abuse. And I know that it's largely essentially thought to be related to just a few media reports of different communities. Actually, as a reviewer, I review academic journal articles, and there's a major article out of a major public health program and well-respected hospital on the East Coast that actually is developing a study that shows the same thing to be true. I guess as a reviewer, I said that the study should absolutely be published. Will it be published? I'm not sure. But there also is research-based evidence to support that there were increases in severe and fatal injuries throughout the course of this. And again, when we think about that, our fear is we're worried about these cases too. But the idea being that the only time we actually received a report that child abuse was occurring when it reached the state that the child was near death or had such serious injury that they had to be seen in an ER or hospital. We also know that during this time we saw almost record-breaking gun sales just through the roof when you look at the chart there. And this was, I think, in the New York Times that shared this, or that provide you this visual, but again, very nearly more gun sales than we've ever seen. So again, you think about all the stress, all the concern, everything that we're talking about, and you add much more guns into the equation. You know, if you're familiar with research and data in this area at all, you know that domestic violence homicides are dramatically increased when there's a gun in the home. And unfortunately, that's what we've seen. So here's just an estimate of, or not estimate, but what's being reported in a few different communities that occurred during the lockdown. And we just see these dramatic increases in domestic violence homicides. So while we also saw the increased risk and the heightened number of child abuse fatalities, we also see the same to be true in domestic violence homicides. Kind of the chilling and haunting words that stuck with me from a sheriff, I believe it was Texas. I'd have to go back and look at it, a Texas community. You know, he said, we've already had more domestic violence homicides during 1 month of lockdown than we had all of last year. And our fear is that there are just more bodies out there that we haven't been made aware of yet. And again, I think that happened in many communities, and you can see it from the numbers there, just a dramatic increase in these reported homicides as well. Again, something I think that's pretty compelling to think about, and this article was originated in rural Alaska, but there were actually multiple communities in the U.S. where we saw more deaths related to domestic violence than COVID-19 during the course of the lockdown. Again, something I think pretty important and kind of obviously very concerning to think about. Another way that deaths rise during these types of things, I alluded to earlier, the kind of changes in the way the courts often responded to these types of incidents. There was a lot of concern that that there would be risk for prisoners related to the spread of this virus. This is a heartbreaking incident that occurred here in my city, in Indianapolis, where the perpetrator actually attacked his partner with a hammer. Severe damage, severe injury, would have normally carried a pretty, or should have carried at least a pretty lengthy sentence there in jail or prison, but only served around a day or two. And the concerns were that we didn't want to add more prisoners to a scenario that may, jeopardize their health. So he was released very quickly. I think it was 2 days that he was behind bars, and within a month he had returned and killed her. So again, when we think about these types of things, and as we're making decisions, like I said, one of my major concerns was I get decision making and what you're thinking about and what you're doing, but where is family violence and these vulnerable victims in that decision making process? Also, we saw officers killed during lockdown. Again, we know that domestic violence is one of the highest risks. Actually, the paper I submitted last night, which will be my new academic article, probably out, I think, in a couple weeks, looks specifically at talks about officers and risk when they respond to these incidents. We know that there's good data to suggest that officers are more likely to be shot and killed when responding to domestic violence than any other single type of incident. And again, there's no reason to believe that risk didn't increase as well. This is an officer, unfortunately, here in Indianapolis that was killed responding to a domestic violence incident during the lockdown period. So many of us, we felt overwhelmed by everything that was occurring. The idea was kind of thrown around that we've never seen anything like this, and to a certain extent, that's true. Obviously, in our lifetimes, there's been nothing quite like this. But I do think that there actually was precedent for at least a potential opportunity to be more effective in our response. And this frustrates me that I didn't see this before. And here in Indiana, the events that we're about to describe don't happen often. But I was frustrated that I'd never seen this before. But at least moving forward now, I think it's important to note this. When we think about natural disasters and those that occur all over, the average is globally 1 per day. So these things occur every day. Somewhere around the world, there's a wealth of information and data relating to them. When we think about what's reported in literature directly following a natural disaster, look at the characteristics you see listed there. We see an increase in controlling behaviors, often among males, at least what's reported in literature. We see key community organizations closed. We see a sudden unemployment and diminished resources. We see spike stress, limited social support. And doesn't that sound familiar, to some of the things we experienced. What happens to family violence after natural disasters? Again, literature is overwhelming, almost always a dramatic increase. It is very hard to look for a study that finds family violence remaining the same or going down after a natural disaster. They always, almost always, I found actually one specific incident that didn't report an increase, but I can get more into that as we continue. But almost always a dramatic increase in family violence. Here's an example. I know this is a lot to digest, so again, I can share on my slides too. But here's a slide I put together just showing examples of that and the source for that. Again, any type of, we think of hurricanes, earthquakes, flooding, we even have Mount St. Helens in here. Anything you look at, you almost always see this increase. And I know there are differences, right, in natural disasters and what we experienced. In terms of a natural disaster, you see the immediate physical destruction that we didn't necessarily witness in terms of what we're dealing with. But in many ways, I actually think what we're dealing with may be even worse, and again, may result in even further prolonged periods of these types of increases that you're seeing there. A very important piece when you look at the natural disaster literature, again, understanding that there's likely some, or at least potentially some correlations here to what we're dealing with, is pets. I mean, it's so important when you dive into literature and you really take a look at families who flee the pending disaster, families who choose to stay in a dangerous environment. Pets are such an important piece of that decision-making process. Pets are family. A recent survey found that 95% of Americans consider their pet to be part of the family. They're almost never included in family violence intervention plans, which we'll get into as we continue. But they are almost always by most Americans. And I don't know what was wrong with the other 5% who didn't list pets as family. But if they didn't understand the question or if they're having a bad day, but pets are overwhelmingly considered by Americans to be a part of their family. Here's some quotes from, again, natural disaster literature. Vulnerable people may be reluctant to evacuate without their animals. They may decline emergency accommodation if their animal is unwelcome and may struggle more than others to cope with recovery and rebuilding without them. Given that more than half the population own pets, there is arguably more risk in not helping people to safely accommodate animals in their emergency plans. And as we continue and look at some more of this information, we know that when we look at post-disaster, when stress is high and all these things are happening, humans will often risk their own life to save their pets. We see this, if we can flip it, being a key motivator to change. So if the idea is we do have a safe place for your pet, and particularly before Hurricane Katrina, that wasn't an option. Things have changed since then a little bit. But if we do have a safe plan where pets can be protected too, we will see individuals and humans and families in these homes saying, well, this is the only way to keep your pet safe. You need to evacuate. And when we flip it like that, we find some success. And again, we see these studies that indicate over and over again that people will not leave if they can't bring their pet with them. And it makes sense, right? If you think, again, I talked about my dog saving my life. Think about your pets and experiences you've had with them and the idea of leaving them behind in an environment where they're unlikely to survive. Very difficult. Nearly 10% of all flood-related fatalities in Australia from the period you see there resulted from attempts to save a pet, even if it wasn't their own pet. So we're talking about first responders and others around the scene, jumping in there to try to do those things. A U.S. study indicated that about 80% of Americans would risk their life to save their pet. If pet owners evacuate a natural disaster, they are very likely to return. And we often see that being the case, particularly when there are children involved who miss that pet, who worry about that pet. They leave a dangerous environment knowing a natural disaster is pending, but come back for that animal. And I think that's important to know as we continue. Again, as I said, humans will risk their own lives to save these pets. And what's often identified, particularly before Hurricane Katrina, some things, like I said, have been changed since then, fortunately. But safety of pets was often thought of as being the greatest barrier to families evacuating a natural disaster. When we think about, again, after these types of disasters, which I think do provide some precedent for what we've dealt with, the difficulty with what we're dealing with now, though, is it's a slow motion process, and that's why I often describe COVID-19 as a slow motion disaster. Again, we talked about this dramatic upheaval, and often there's physical destruction when we talk natural disaster. This has been a prolonged event where stress has dramatically increased over long periods of time, why I'm even more concerned about outcomes related to this than natural disasters. And when we look at natural disasters, the literature seems to be pretty clear that there's an increase and request for assistance relating to family violence, particularly shelters, for up to 1 year after the natural disaster concludes. So again, a concern that I have that these increases in calls that we're now getting, or this idea of increasing abuse incidents that we're hearing about aren't going anywhere, but rather may continue for periods for up to 1 year or later after the pandemic concludes. Often we see children being lost in the shuffle. Unfortunately, we see that in natural disaster literature as well. When DV reports after natural disasters, it's not uncommon for DV reports to drop off and then dramatically increase, again, like what we're seeing. But sometimes those child abuse reports never come. And again, something I'm afraid of too, right? And that children have been exposed to significant acts of abuse over a prolonged period of time. And will that abuse ever be reported? Obviously is a major concern when we think about the necessity of effective intervention and working with these kids and knowing what's happened and trying to mitigate that harm. Finding out about it and detecting it is so critical. And again, my concern after the pandemic, much as after natural disasters, is that kids unfortunately often get lost in that shuffle, and we don't identify the kids who are impacted. We see after natural disasters, and what I would fear after this pandemic as well, is this idea of victims blaming the abuse on the stress, on the hard times related to the incident that occurred. And this idea that, well, once things get back to normal, it won't happen again, and it's just, it doesn't seem to be the case when we look at these types of incidents that, unfortunately for many of these families, a new normal was created during this lockdown, and the idea that the abuse won't continue to occur when things do return to normal and all those types of things is unfortunately not often the case. So I think, again, an important point to think about. When we see about, after a natural disaster, we often do see unified communities. They seem to come together more. There's often a positive response to law enforcement, first responders who assist families in these types of scenarios. Anything but that is what we're seeing now. We think about all the division that we're experiencing. Again, I think I'm concerned about family violence after natural disasters. Like I said, I'm frustrated I wasn't more into this research before all this happened. I'm definitely locked in on it now. But I think what we're seeing now is likely to be even more concerning than what we see after natural disasters for many of the reasons you see listed there. Another important point that I think we don't often talk about that does come out when you look at natural disaster literature. We think about high stress among those who are unemployed, who lost a job, and increased risk of abuse in those scenarios. But the disaster literature points out too that there's also high stress among those who are considered critical or who were still employed during lockdown, right? When we think about medical providers and first responders and those who were still working during lockdown, there seems to be clear indication that obviously there's increased stress there too in the conditions that they're working in. And just a reminder, there are some studies, the study that's depicted here, or the picture reminds me of that study. It was a study out of that looked at Australian bushfires and actually noted a pretty dramatic increase in perpetrated domestic violence by first responders during the course of the fires and the things that they've responded there to. So again, I think it's important to note that. We think about high risk among those who lose their job, and again, we think of unemployment as a risk factor. When we think about pandemics and other types of events such as these, we also think about those experiencing high risk or high stress who are still working. So I think it's an important thing to think about too. One thing that became very clear as we thought about COVID-19 and how it's impacted everything is the need for new partners, right? This dramatically changed everything. I shared that pie chart earlier that showed where our reports come from. Essentially, all of those entities were separated from children during the course of this event. And so I think it, as Marie alluded to in her presentation as well, it really highlighted the need for new partnerships. We should have been partnering with these agencies, honestly, before all this, but now we absolutely have to and moving forward. And again, I'm thinking of agencies that were still out in the communities even when lockdown orders were issued. I'm thinking of home repair, trash delivery or trash pickup, mail delivery, even thinking about food delivery and grocery pickup, such as you see depicted there. Again, all these individuals were still out there, still in communities. Many of them, from my own experience working with law enforcement here in Indiana, many of these agencies are willing and actually very interested in being asked to play a greater role in detecting abuse in the home. One of the things that I think would be particularly helpful is developing just a simple little card, particularly when I think of mail carriers. Just a simple card that says, here's what we're looking for, these are risk factors, here's who you call if you see it. And just something simple that they can keep in their car there, and you can't underestimate the impact that that could potentially have. So again, important to be thinking outside the box. All of these entities we should have been thinking about before, but now moving forward, absolutely, after what we've seen, we know we need to be better engaging them. Also, neighbors historically don't report abuse of humans, at least. We'll get into that here in a moment as I continue. As very frequently, we know domestic violence, at least here in Indianapolis, is only 8% of reports come from a neighbor. And so we know that they are less likely to report abuse. But again, very important that we're engaging these types of partnerships moving forward. Well, now and moving forward. The one I want to focus on, I think that is so critical, is involving animal welfare in our efforts. I was talking about this again before all these things happened, but particularly when we experienced everything we did and saw what we did during the course of this pandemic. In my mind, it became even more clear of the need to engage animal welfare in our efforts to protect humans in homes as well. We often focus again on the adult victim when we're thinking about domestic violence, but we know that 60% of the time, at least in my studies, 60% of the time when domestic violence occurs, it occurs in a household where at least one child resides, and 80% of the homes have at least one pet. So in general, Americans, I think the average is about 65% of American homes have a pet. That number goes up to 80% when we're talking about domestic violence occurring in the home. So families where abuse or domestic violence occurs are even more likely to have a pet. So again, a very critical piece of the puzzle that I think we often miss or fail to fully recognize. When we think about what pets provide, really in all homes, we think about protection, comforts, friendship, a sense of purpose, acceptance, stability. You know, these are just examples. They provide so much. And we think about this, again, for everyone. But how much more important are the components you see listed here for those in homes impacted by abuse? For many kids in particular, and everything you see listed here is a critical component of emotional health and well-being. For many kids in these homes, unfortunately, or the reality is, the pet may be their best chance at everything you see listed there. And again, this was important before COVID-19, and it became extremely important during the pandemic when children may have lost opportunities to see teachers and friends and others who may have helped mitigate some of the harm they were experiencing. They became even more dependent, likely, on the pets in the home to experience these types of things. If you'll note when I talked about natural disasters, we see the same thing to be true when we talk about domestic violence. Many victims will not leave a home and have to leave a pet behind. They will stay in that home if they can't safely take their pet with them. I know of victims who have left and taken their kids and gotten to shelter, but the shelter didn't allow pets, and they returned. They just couldn't handle it. They were so worried about harm to their pet that they couldn't even focus on healing and moving forward. It just became so much for them that they left the shelter and went back. A recent survey found that 90% of victims of IPV, this was an international survey, feel that having a safe place for their pet would make the decision to leave easier. We think of all the barriers these victims face to leaving these homes and how we encourage them to do so. But again, all these barriers, you have to pay attention. If you've got 90% of the population saying, do this one thing, and I'll be more likely to leave. How many DV shelters in the U.S. do you think currently, or what proportion of DV shelters in the U.S. do you think currently allow for pets on site? And you can just think of that number in your head. It's only 17% of U.S. shelters, again, domestic violence-wise. I talked about after Hurricane Katrina, some changes were made to better protect pets after natural disasters. Great organizations such as Red Rover and others are working to help bridge the gap for domestic violence and family violence, but we still see this what, in my opinion, an incredible shortfall. Still only 17% of U.S. shelters allow pets on site. Some will allow for foster programs, and that's better than nothing. But for children in particular, being separated from that pet, many of these children know only abuse and harm. And so even if you tell them that the pet is safe, if they can't see that, they're not going to believe it. So again, when we think about emotional harm and protecting these children, it's so important to do it in a way that they can see that pet and know that it's safe. Another example and another way to look at this, I think, is important. Again, I talked about analyzing nearly 10,000 police incidents of domestic violence, and I've gotten well over the 100,000s now in different communities. What I found, though, is that on average, victims of domestic violence will report, if they're going to 911 on the 10th incident. So they will call law enforcement after 10 violent incidents occurred. And again, you know, I hear often from agencies that they feel like they're behind the 8 ball from the get-go with these families. And I think this speaks to that, right? If we already have this cycle of 10 violent incidents before we ever get a report, obviously, you know, we're in trouble. It doesn't mean we can't work there and we can't make progress and still reach these families. But again, you're talking about a cycle of violence that these children have witnessed, and the adults in the home as well. When the IPV perpetrator also harms pets in the home, again, important to know even before COVID-19, especially during COVID-19, knowing these types of things. We see this critical delay, as you see highlighted in green there. So on average, victims will report on the 10th incident. If the perpetrator also has a history of abusing pets in the home, victims will wait till they've experienced 20 to 40. So now we have this whole extra, you know, massive amount of incidents. And I talked about how difficult it is to work with families after 10 things have occurred. Imagine trying to mitigate some of the harm after 20 to 40 things have occurred. And so you see this green zone here that I call the critical delay. We often see in studies that when the victim seeks shelter, that's their highest risk for the adult, and there's good reason to believe that, right? When we look at homicide data, we see victims are often leaving a home or attempting to flee a home when that homicide occurs. For me, and in my opinion, I think the risk for children and pets is so significant, obviously all the time, but particularly in this critical delay. We often hear perpetrators saying, you know, I started targeting pets and children in the home as a kind of a means to regain control. I can sense the victim was going to leave, that something was going to change, and so I had to change the way I approach. So again, we're worried about safety of children and pets throughout the course of the timeline. But I do think it's important to note that when there is pet abuse, again, we're worried because victims will wait even longer. And again, thinking about COVID-19 and how that even probably further exacerbated that. I'll just skip through this quickly so we're good on time. But the idea of animal welfare and human welfare working together is not novel. It's not new. It's actually where we started. So when I talk about improving our efforts to protect animals and children, I'm not saying, you know, this is something groundbreaking. This is actually a return to our roots. So in the U.S., actually child welfare efforts sprang from animal welfare efforts there in New York. As we saw Etta Wheeler reaching out to Henry Berg, who started the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals in New York, in a collaboration between the two, with particular concern of a child you see listed there, Mary Ellen, resulting in the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. 8 years after we saw this first official program to prevent cruelty to animals. So again, not anything new. Over the course of time, we've separated, and I think that it's unfortunate, but we often see child welfare, human welfare, animal welfare all kind of separated. No reason for that. We should be working together just as we were from the start. And I absolutely think, even before COVID-19, but particularly now, that there's very clear reason and benefit to doing that. Another thing that I do to try to visualize this a little better, and I'll get into why this is important and related to the pandemic as well. So I'm working with Prevent Child Abuse Indiana to look at visualizing some of the data and reports we see. So here you see police reported domestic violence over the course of a year in Marion County, Indiana, and then reports from animal control during the same calendar year. And I do want to clarify, this is not a straight population density map. The area where you see the highest concentration here is actually about 12th on the list of population density. We actually see greater density in some of these areas over here. So this is not just straight population. It truly is that compelling of where we see DV reports coming in and animal reports coming in. Looking at now at Allen County, Indiana, another community, and again, seeing a very similar type of overlap and overlay. And then finally, Boone County, Indiana, and looking at the distribution of where DV calls are coming in and where animal welfare, animal control reports coming in. Again, I think, in my opinion, a compelling reason to be partnering with animal welfare. Another way to look at it is by looking at hotspot mapping. So I take all those incidents and look at where the highest concentration of incidents occur. This is in Brown County, Indiana, a very rural community. Again, one of the most common arguments I get when I show those data spot maps is that, well, this is population density. It's not. Even when we look in very rural communities. You look at animal control runs there from the period you see there, and then where DV police reports came during the same time period. Another important thing I think to think about, and this refers back to that critical delay I mentioned, animal control runs, this is in the Zionsville area in Boone County again, Indiana, where you see the highest concentration of animal control runs in 2017. The year following, where do you see the most DV runs? So if you remember that critical delay, that often encompasses, as I said, somewhere between anywhere from 10 to 30 incidents in 8 to 12 months. And so let's say that while, as we know, during that delay, children and pets may be at higher risk, at least what my data suggests. If there is an animal control report coming in and we acknowledge that and understand that abuse and harm to animals also indicates risk for humans, again, we're looking at potentially a whole year earlier that we might be able to intervene and try to work with these families. I think it speaks to the importance of animal control. The reality is in Indiana, I think it's 33 to 34% of counties don't even have animal control in our state, and it's like that in many other states as well. And we're missing such a huge opportunity there. It's so necessary to have these types of things coming in. Because look at this. So this is the dedicated. So in 2016 and 17, Boone County, Indiana had no dedicated animal control. 2018, January 1st, they dedicated animal control. They tell the community, you know, these calls matter. We're concerned by harm to animals. They've got someone who's leading this all up or heading this all up who also understands the risk and overlap. And look at the difference in calls from 1 year. And all they did is dedicate an animal control related agency. And when we look at that spatially, again, you look at all the extra opportunities to potentially intervene in homes where humans are at risk too. Another important point to make about this is when we look at DV calls, they most commonly come from a victim. When I look at my data and my research, victims are the ones usually who report domestic violence themselves. They'll be the ones that call 911. Again, when we think about lockdown, COVID-19, they couldn't do that. They didn't feel comfortable doing that. It wasn't safe to do that. Reports of animal abuse, 80% of the time come from a neighbor. So while 80% or 70 to 80% of victim reports of domestic violence come from the victim themselves, 80% of reports of animal abuse come from a neighbor. Totally different report source. They don't have the same barriers to reporting that victims in the home had or especially had during lockdown when there may not be opportunity to do so. Again, thinking about the lockdown scenario, neighbors were more likely to be in the home and potentially more likely able to spot animal abuse and report it. So again, when we revisit these maps, you may not have been getting these dots here on the left because DV calls dropped off, and it's just a terrible feeling, obviously, when that happens, as I said, because we're not knowing what's going on. These calls kept coming because these are neighbors reporting these incidents. And so again, always important to think about these things. It became extremely important during the lockdown to remember that report sources actually differ. And while we can't get neighbors, they only report about 8% of these calls, neighbors do, but they report 80% of these calls. So again, when we bring in animal welfare, when we bring in this extra data component, we have a whole new report source and opportunity to not only protect animals in these homes, but humans as well. And I'm going to wrap up here in the next few minutes so that we can have some time for questions. But I want to share some additional characteristics when I talk about increased risk. Again, I think this is important during COVID-19, but I also think it's important all the time, and we'll continue afterward, obviously. We look at just a single characteristic. So IPV, in my studies, just looking at IPV in general, intimate partner violence, knowing that 8% of the time there's a history of forced sex. Knowing just one characteristic, that the IPV suspect also harms animals in the home, jumps your risk of rape by more than 3%. It does something also concerning with strangulation. So in Indianapolis, this rate's already scary, to be honest. 10 to 30% is kind of the national average. 47% in general, when we think about intimate partner violence, strangulation occurs in the home. And again, we're worried about the adult who's experiencing this. We're very worried about the children who are also witnessing this. 47% in general, one piece. IPV suspect also harms pets. Now we're up to 76%. Thinking about living with a daily fear, the suspect will kill them. 35% in general, jumps to nearly 80%, adding one piece that the IPV suspect harms pets as well. For all the things that I've described, obviously pets are so important in these homes. They were during lockdown. They are all the time. Another just critical thing, and we think about these children who were isolated from all their support sources. There are good studies and good data out there to suggest that, and this study in particular actually found that pets, particularly pet dogs, were actually a better buffer to mitigate against the effects of emotional harm in homes where abuse occurs than caregivers in the home. These pets are just so critical to these children, and there are several studies that show that. I'm going to skip through some of the, like I said, as I talked about my own personal experience, every presentation I give, I always give it as if it's my last. It's just the way I try to bring the energy and passion to each one. So I always bring more slides than I can get through. So I may skip through some here at the end, but I would be glad to share those if you have interest as I want to wrap up so we have plenty of time for questions. I guess I'll finish on these last couple of pieces, but when I talk about this pet piece, it's not only a risk for families, but agencies who respond and work with these families as well. We know IPV suspects in general, about half of them have mental illness or substance abuse. Again, jumps to 74% knowing that one thing. When we look at suicide, 10% in general jumps to 40%, adding in the single piece of the perpetrator abuses animals. Access to a firearm, 31% jumps to 68%, again, knowing the same thing. And then when we think about using a weapon against a partner, 26% in general jumps all the way up to 66%. So I say all this to say during pandemic, after the pandemic, before the pandemic, I don't think we can really afford not to be including animals in our anytime we're working with these families. They're so critical to children, and knowing that abuse of an animal is occurring obviously greatly spikes risk for children and adults in these homes. It's such an important piece. I think it became even more important during the pandemic and lockdown, but I think it will always be important and something we need to think about. Many agencies do ask law enforcement when they respond about pets. Here you see an example from the, I think it's Massachusetts, of questions officers ask when responding to every domestic violence scene. They ask, question 19, has the offender abused animals or pets? I like that they're asking it. We need to be asking it sooner though, because a yes here gives you yeses here. Just knowing statistically what's out there, and I think at this point, looking at research and understanding what studies exist, again, knowing that the offender abuses pets there gives you yeses here. So again, it just dramatically spikes as risk unfortunately an indicator of great risk in these homes. Another thing I often try to point out to those who work with these families is while data suggests that these suspects who harm pets present the greatest risk to those in the home and those responding, they are significantly more likely than those who don't harm pets to appear, as you see there, calm, apologetic, and crying. The data is pretty overwhelming, and it's pretty significant that they are much more likely to appear in that manner. But again, data suggests they present great risk. I think it's important to note that we don't know what lies just below the surface. These perpetrators and suspects are actually less likely to be arrested as well. So again, it's just things to think about and remember. Regardless of what you're seeing from a physical, observable disposition, you do not know what lies just below that surface. Some final thoughts. Desperate times call for. I don't necessarily like to say desperate measures. I don't think that invokes good feelings from the public when we hear that that's where we're at. So I like to say desperate times call for innovation. And when we think about COVID-19, the pet piece is obviously critical. Another thing I think that was interesting too to think about it, and as I thought about more moving forward, so many hotels empty during lockdown. Employees were kind of laid off or furloughed for a potential period of time, and these hotel rooms just sat there empty. Many of them might have even been pet friendly as well. We did see hotels stepping up and saying medical providers could stay for free. What a potential opportunity though to house some victims of family violence that while many shelters were at capacity or over capacity and had nowhere to put many victims, I observed many heartbreaking accounts where I think in Queensland in particular that they were estimating over 30 to 50 calls a day came in that they couldn't answer because of the dramatic increase in volume. But again, thinking about potential resources that were there during this that might have been better used. We do know, and what I've heard at least from some victims during this, is that they were allowed to still get the mail by the perpetrator, that the perpetrator still allowed them to the mailbox to get the mail. What about some sort of system in place that's a partnership with the Postal Service that if the victim can, and again, these are things we need to have in place before this happens again. If they have some sort of non-obvious sticker or something that they can get onto the mailbox that will alert the mail service delivery person that I need to call this in, I need to report this is concerning. Again, things to think about next time many of these victims were worried before lockdown occurred that their risk was going to be higher. So even if we can figure out ways to do some of those things again, if this ever occurs again. And then also the importance of being able to text. And in some communities that happens, and in many communities it may happen, but it's not been made known clearly to the victims. Many of these victims couldn't call 911 because they were around the perpetrator, but if they could have texted and known that they could have done that, there might have been opportunity there. The final piece that I'll leave you with is the idea of essential, and what was essential. And I hate that word, essentially, it implies that others are less important and things like that. But at least in my community, and I know in many others, while mental health services seem to dramatically increase, or at least opportunity for them, I know there were still some virtual opportunities, but I know for many victims of family violence and abuse that described to me that they didn't feel that they got enough out of that, or that it was helpful to them. But while mental health services seem to kind of take a back seat, at least in my community, there was always a steady flow of alcohol. Our liquor stores were deemed essential almost immediately. And again, we know that alcohol consumption actually has been linked to an increase in severity in these types of incidents. Interestingly, there were actually a few countries, and particularly in South Africa, that banned alcohol during the course of the lockdown. One of the main reasons I hear for continuing alcohol sales are the fear that ERs will be overwhelmed with alcohol withdrawal patients. What they at least found in South Africa and some of these other countries is that actually their ER strain was down when they reduced sales of alcohol, because it also eliminated alcohol-related accidents and things such as that. So again, remembering what is essential if unfortunately, if we do ever face these types of scenarios again, and remembering that. At the end of the day, essentially we weren't ready. Again, I'm frustrated at myself for not being more prepared for these types of things. I think about just my own life, and I believed this lie from such a young age that my life was of no account, that I had no value. It's just always what I believed. People would ask me, well, what do you want to be when you grow up? I'd always say it doesn't matter. But that dog continued to breathe life into me. And I would go on and believe, that, well, it's impossible to be a good dad without a blueprint. You're never going to have a family. You're never going to be happy. And, nothing can be further from the truth, as I hold my third child there, my precious daughter. And so again, I say all these things. We know things are always difficult. They became even more difficult during the pandemic, but these kids are absolutely worth it, as you know. And so, my plea and my call today is to think about the things we've discussed today, and what, if any, even if it's just one component, might be able to be included in your community to try to be more effective in reaching these children and getting to them. I looked at about 175 studies for today's talk. I just have an example, 42 there. Could share the full list if you have interest, and then here's some of my contact information if you have any questions or would like to follow up. But with that, Rich, I'll pass it on to you to see what we have in terms of questions.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Andrew. That was really wonderful. And I look forward to getting your slide presentation. We'll put that up on the website along with some of your other articles. Let me just open it up and see who may have some questions or comments for Andrew. Let you go ahead, just unmute yourself and ask him at this point. And I do see you have one question that's in the chat. So when you have a break, you might touch on that. Well, I'll go ahead and read that one. And
I'm getting into it now. Sorry about that. There, I got it now.
You got it?
Yes.
You want to read it?
So IPV, sorry about that. Yeah, so IPV looks like you've got that covered, intimate partner violence. IPV is actually confusing because different people refer to it to mean different things. So it can also mean interpersonal violence. It can mean interpartner violence. For my particular study, it was intimate partner violence, which was looking at partner violence there. Are you aware of initiatives to increase availability of texting? Seems like necessary with the ability to call in a house. I also could probably say. So I know in Indiana there were a few communities that came out. There was in the Valparaiso area. There was one that I believe is the YMCA that actually came out with a media campaign. Again, we just can't assume these resources may be there, but we can never assume that victims are aware of them. And like I said, after several homicides in Indianapolis, local leaders finally came out and said, "Hey, you need to stay in your home related to the virus, but if it's not safe to do that, don't do that." They several homicides in before that happened. We just can't assume those types of things. And so I know there are some initiatives out there. I don't know how many include the idea of child abuse and reaching children and that capacity. But there are some communities that made it a point to make that known. I've seen more in the last few months too, so I know that it seems to be moving forward. But I think that it's something that's very obvious. This scenario made that very obvious, and it should have been in place before too. Again, thinking about how high risk it would be to call a perpetrator in the home and try to vocalize those types of things. You know, texting absolutely needs to be an option.
Anyone else want to jump in?
Andrew, I just unmuted my mic.
There, Rich, on, are you aware of any initiatives of this in Minnesota? Maybe that's something that Safe Passage could advocate for.
Right. No, I don't know of anything at all going on in Minnesota, although we are, you know, I was sharing with Andrew before that we are hoping to get some interest from the state agencies and having a coordinated plan. And I do.
Rich, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Rich. I'm going to grab a glass of water over here real quick just so I can answer questions, if that's okay. I will be right back. Thank you.
Okay. You know, there have been some reports of school districts around the country. I don't think you can, you know, call this some kind of a pattern, but having a special word that they give to students and say that if you're in, you know, trouble, if you're in danger, to text this, you know, special word, this secret word to your teacher. And there are also things where teachers will have like a Likert scale, you know, like a 1 to 5 from a really distressed frowny face to a happy face. And they'll ask kids to click on that. And if a child says that they're, you know, if the one that's the worst sort of says, I really need some help right now, that the teacher will follow up with that. And of course, all of those kinds of things raise concerns among, you know, some groups about parental rights and invasion of privacy and that sort of thing. So the balance in terms of what we are concerned about with children, what we're concerned about with regard to adults is out of balance. You know, that we're not sufficiently willing to, you know, reach out to children for fear that it will be considered invasive by the parents. So hopefully, if we get something going with the state agencies, they'll develop a plan, and we certainly will advocate for those approaches like texting and giving kids a little survey from school teachers and so forth. And then Bob was going to ask, I think, a question.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Andrew, thanks for this really compelling, especially bringing the pet aspect into it. My question is, are you aware of, in Indiana, particularly Indianapolis, of any restorative justice initiatives around domestic violence issues? The reason I ask is we're doing some of that type of work in Washington County here in the Twin Cities.
Can you further define restorative justice, just so I make sure that we're on the same?
Well, what we're doing is sentencing circles.
Okay.
Where we take an offense and numerous parties have to agree that the case gets sent to circle. But if the perpetrator and the victim and the prosecutor and the defense attorney, if there is one, agree, then it can get referred to us, and then we develop a sentence. And obviously, for more serious issues, it's not appropriate, but try to get in on the ground floor, so to speak.
Absolutely, which I would love to learn more about. I'm not aware directly of anything here locally that encompasses that. I know that there is at least growing interest in including the pet piece in these types of things, but the reality is that our local shelters still do not allow pets on site. As I said, only 17% do in the entire country, but here in Indianapolis, there's one of them has a pet fostering, the others don't. So again, I think many of the families that I'm describing today would likely never even report the abuse because there would be nowhere for their pet to go. I mean, again, I think of all the times that I've spoken directly with victims who have described that, is that I'll live in my car before I report abuse because they won't take my pet. And when we think about how important these pets are to these people, it's essentially, that is their corner. And so when as shelters or as other organizations, we try to get them to trust us, but yet we're saying, but leave your corner, leave your only support behind. And it's just such a dramatic barrier. So definitely anything I can provide in terms of assistance and the great work it sounds like you guys have going there, I would be glad to. But as far as something that mirrors that, I'm not aware of it here in my community. And unfortunately, I think we're behind in some of these issues, and it's been frustrating. I live here, and so I want to make the biggest difference, obviously, where I live and to do these things, but a lot of closed doors here locally. But again, I'm finding open doors largely anywhere else in the country and around the globe as I continue to work. So again, thank you for the great work that you're doing there in your community. Anything I provide to be of assistance, I would be glad to. But I'm not directly aware of anything specific to that or that mirrors that here locally.
Yeah, it's not not widespread in the U.S. It's more of a national model in Canada.
Okay.
But there are pockets. Minnesota's, I guess, fairly well represented in that area. Maybe more so of any state in the country now. But there are pockets around the country that do this. The pet aspect, though, really strikes home with comparing it to the, everybody's aware of the natural disaster around pets, that people don't want to leave their pets. You see that quite frequently, but I guess I really wasn't aware of that issue translating to the domestic abuse arena, which it's a very good thing to be aware of.
Are you speaking, Rich? I can't hear you. I'm not sure if.
There we go.
Okay.
Too much sun on my screen. I'm not aware of anybody that is doing connection, trying to connect animal welfare and child welfare and, and I've been watching the literature on this. Are you aware of any jurisdictions that are trying to work on that? Would you be able to hear me?
Who was the question to? Sorry, I couldn't tell who you were asking.
I was asking you if you were aware of any, counties or states that are working on trying to get animal welfare and child welfare and domestic violence people to work together, cross-report, that kind of thing.
That's what I'm trying to do with this program with Prevent Child Abuse Indiana. As far as we know, we're the only program. It's the only initiative of its kind that I can find in the world. Like I said, I speak internationally at times, and no one else seems to. This idea of bringing in this data mapping, which again, we know these things exist, but it does seem to be powerful when we bring in this actual visual. So that's the long play of what I'm doing. Is I'm trying to engage community after community. I just actually worked with Indiana's wealthiest county. I thought that was an important part to bring in too, to also show similar overlap. And we often think about, we get, I know risk factors are important and they're quoted in studies, but we get in this idea that these types of things only happen in certain types of communities, certain types of homes.
Right.
And then, I don't know that I made many friends by it, but the report I just shared from Indiana's wealthiest county showed that it occurred there too, and also showed the same overlap. So definitely in play. I'm trying to figure out how to, and like I said, for whatever reason, I don't know. It's not that there's animosity between child welfare and animal welfare. It's just a missing piece. I called all 92 Indiana counties, their animal welfare. Every county, 90 out of 92, were overwhelmingly interested in being more engaged and working and better protecting children. It's just a piece that somehow over time we've dropped, but I think it's critical. I'm actually writing a book on this topic too that should be out, I think, in January. Again, my dog saved my life. There's so much passion for this particular piece because I do see it as important in driving change in some of these areas.
Well, if I can ask a follow on, you've mentioned it's come up in some of the literature here and there about people like, UPS workers, postal workers, people who do repairs on houses, those kind of people that you mentioned, equipping them with some information so that they have 5 things to look for. And if you see one of these, you should, call Child Protection. Are you aware of anybody that is working with, the United Postal, the Postal Service or UPS or any of those folks?
So I have specific law enforcement contacts, particularly with the ones I'm thinking of are all sheriffs who are working with their own community and providing those pieces, and have seen them be very receptive. Again, I think so many times we think about family violence, abuse, domestic violence, child abuse. It's such an overwhelming issue. We're working with such limited resources. Many of these other agencies are out there though that will help if we ask them. And that's what I get told so many times. It's like, well, no one ever asks us, and so it's finding ways to connect these dots. So I do know of some specific examples here in Indiana in terms of from a public standpoint, obviously there's nothing published there, and they're not going to go public and announce that program is happening because it's the thing that we always deal with when we talk about these types of things. We want to be creative. We want to think outside the box. We also don't want to inform perpetrators of a way, all the time of what we're doing. So I know that they're not going to go public, but I know that there are communities and examples here within my home state where we are seeing a interest there. And many of these postal workers, again, this is every day, particularly when we bring in the pet abuse piece and concern to animals, they already have families and homes they're concerned about. And even just asking them doesn't mean waiting then for them to say something. They may say it right away. Well, now that you say that, there is this home that I'm concerned about. Many of them already have homes they're worried about. And so it's just asking them and engaging them and letting them know that they're an important part of this may open that up immediately. So,
yeah.
Particularly, again, think of the pets. Pets, again, are, especially when we think about lockdown things, they're even more likely to be outside when we think about the weather being, there's better opportunity, if you think about it from that perspective, often to detect that pet abuse because the pet is more likely to be outside, whether it's in a front yard or at backyard, wherever, and that's why I think neighbors report it more often because the pets are outside more. And there's, so again, I think there's so many reasons why it opens up doors to preventing abuse in a wide range of ways.
Right. I mean, I've mentioned this a few times, to reporters and other people around the business, and they've said, well, the postal worker or a repair person or the guard, sanitary worker is not going to want to get involved, in that. They don't, but you're saying you think it's probably the opposite. People would be sort of wanting an outlet for their concern, and they don't have a way to, to deal with that concern. So,
well, particularly during the course of what we saw, I mean, there's something empowering in telling people that you are important. Like, again, we think about again the terminology of what's essential, but saying, hey, essentially most of our reporting of abuse comes from teachers. It comes from these other agencies where these families are not being seen by. Like, you are one of our best chances at seeing these types of things. So would you mind stepping up and again, there's so much about all of these things that are presentation and how you word them and again, not to change the message, but just thinking about how you present it. And that's what I've seen to be successful when you present it that way. Extremely interested in saying, it doesn't mean they always will be, and obviously some will say no, but most when you present it like that seem to be interested.
Great. Other comments or questions people want to the mix here?
Andrew, personal question. What was your dog's name growing up, and how many years did you have him or her?
Him, Shelby, 17 years. And like I said, I can remember growing up, I did, like I said, I have observable brain changes from, I worked at a children's hospital and actually was part of I volunteered to go through an MRI machine before the children did. They had added new MRI machines, and it wasn't testing the science. They just have adults go through them to see if there's anything that a child may be concerned by or the process. So I volunteered for that, not knowing what was going to happen. This was long before I understood toxic stress exposure and all those things. Like I said, I was actually, I think, in my mid-20s, and came back with the findings that you have the brain of a severe alcoholic, which was interesting since I had never touched alcohol in my life. My mom had lost 2 brothers to alcohol, and so in living in my home and wanting to take care of them, that was an important piece too, is that I wasn't going to drink because I was trying so hard to counteract all the emotional harm that had been done. And so then finding out that obviously was a bit of a shock. But then learning more about toxic stress exposure. But like I said, I can remember at 15, 16, 13, 14, I just being outside 3 in the morning, 2 in the morning, I never slept. I was always worried my mom was going to be taken from me in the night, that something was going to happen. And so I was up all night, and that dog was who sat out there with me. You know, I'd go to humans and I'd ask for people for support, but I'd never get what I got from my dog, who just sat there with me. And it just can't be overstated how important that was. There were literally some days I would be crying and he would lick the tears from my eyes. Other days he would stand on the edge of the yard and kind of look out like he was looking, like he was taking guard. It almost felt like he was saying, take a moment, rest, like it just can't be put into words, you know, what he did for me in those 17 years I had, you know, and obviously continued to impact me. So.
Must have been tough to lose him.
It was, I don't think I've ever recovered. It took, so I'm trying to think of when I even did lose him. It took about 8 years after he died before I could even look at a picture of him. Just to be honest, I couldn't, like, there's just so, and we find that true for children in these types of environments. There's so much emotion tied to that animal that it just brings back. It brings back good memories, but it brings back pain too. You remember sitting out there with him and the pain you felt. It was literally about 8 years. I know my mom had made me a gift, which was a collage of pictures of me and my dog, and I couldn't look at it when she gave it to me, and it took about 8 years before I told her I could finally have that. Yeah, so it's something that, again, they fill such a piece and such a part that, yeah, I don't know that you ever replace it.
Well, yeah, thanks for sharing all that. That's impactful.
Well, I just think there's opportunity there, and that's why I try to be transparent. I used to not share my story. I just talked about from an act because I have published, so I can present it as a researcher and leave all that other stuff out. But you know, it is my story and it's my truth, and I think there's power in it, and that's why I share it, because I don't want other kids to feel it, and I don't want other people to deal with it. So.
Yeah, thanks much for doing all this.
Yeah. Well, I thank you guys all, like I said, for the opportunity. So.
Yeah. I would say that we will, you know, make ongoing use of these slides, Andrew, and I'll be in touch if, you know, we can get anything going. Stay here. I'm going to leave your contact information up until I let people leave as they want, you know, so that'll give people time, if, you know, to jot down your contact info. I just want to give one last shot if anybody wants to make a comment or ask a question before we close out. Well, I just want to say thank you so much for doing this for us. I'm hoping we can make you a regular part of the landscape here in Minnesota. We'll see. We'll see.
Yeah, glad to help any way I can. So I appreciate the opportunity too, and I appreciate all the work that all of you are doing there in your community. So.
Well, and same to you. I mean, you're a great resource for everybody. So, all right. Well, thank you all for showing up and listening and being part of this. We appreciate it. You know, we have, as I mentioned, other ways coming up that may be a bit more, you know, dry and academic than this, but really worth joining us for. And you know, again, thank you, Andrew, very much, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Rich.
Okay.
And thank you, everyone. Again, thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
So go ahead and feel free to check out if you want, or as I said, oh, well, he took his slide down. So I guess if you need his contact information.
Oh, I can put it back up there maybe. Let's see.
Oh, okay. Yeah, just get a hold of us if you want anything that doesn't end up on our website or that you can't.
Are you seeing it again now?
I'm sorry.
Are you seeing this slide again?
Yeah, you're
Okay.
still. closed. Yes, we're seeing it.
Okay.
But I think we only have half a dozen people left, so I think people have checked out. So I think I will then end the meeting. So no, there's one person left, so maybe she's writing down your information, and I'll wait on that. So thanks again. It's it's the same time for you as for me, so it's probably dinner time. So
Yep.
yeah, all right. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Andrew. That was awesome.
Well, thank
That
you.
was
I
awesome,
appreciate the
yes.
opportunity. So thank you.
Amen to
Yeah, it's
that.
really nice to meet you. Thank you for all your good work.
Thank you. Nice to meet you as well. And thanks
Yeah.
for all the help with everything today. So I appreciate the opportunity. So
We
You
are
bet.
fortunate, Andrew. We just get to meet some amazing people doing this work, you being one of them. So it's something to be grateful for.
well, I appreciate it. So thank you. Like I said, this is how I fight back. So you're
Yeah, I know.
so thank you.
All right. Okay. Talk to you soon.
Okay. Take care.
All
Thanks,
right.
Rich. Thanks, Stephanie. Bye.
Bye.